Christianity can be blamed for what was going on in Rome.
No, I don't think that it can. I think that it can be blamed for its going along with that, with its consent to that, with its silence.
In the beginning days of the church, it wasn't a powerful institution by any means. I mean, the church was being persecuted by the Roman government, but within that system, the instruction was, we can't change the system, but the expectation is that if you were a Christian and you have slaves, that you were to treat them in a proper manner. So it was speaking to, within the system, how to operate in a way that would treat slaves with dignity.
Okay. Yes, sir.
If the locus of moral worth in humans is that they're made in the image of Dei, there's a time coming, at least within certain theological traditions, of death, judgment, heaven, and hell. And so at that point, those who don't pass the test are subject to infinite punishment of infinite duration, but yet they still bear that stamp, and therefore they would still possess that locus of moral worth. And so wouldn't God then be in the bizarre position of committing the ultimate moral atrocity by consigning something made in his image and therefore impressed with his value to that kind of punishment? If God's not, if God can escape that, then would that not imply that the locus is elsewhere?
Yeah, an interesting question. The way I look at the idea of hell is not that this is something that God is choosing for human beings, but rather it's what human beings have chosen for themselves. So in other words, God has an offer to all human beings that, you can enter into a proper relationship with me through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's an invitation to everybody. And God gives people the right and the freedom to choose that or to reject it. But if you reject that offer, then you are essentially saying that I have no interest in being in that relationship. And so, in a sense, God is giving people what they ask for. So I think that you could view that as treating human beings with the highest dignity, in the sense that you are giving them what they want. And so hell is a place where God is absent and where human beings are capable of doing whatever they want.
Could I just respond to that? Sure. I mean, the way that Dr. Rana is speaking about God is the way that sort of a mafia kingpin would speak about his mercifulness and his inability to control the consequences of what might happen to you if you don't follow his, commitment that you had. It's not his responsibility that if you don't come through on the money that you owe him, that you might sleep with the fishes. That's your choice. But it seems strange to suggest that a God that created the afterlife, who allowed at least hell to be a place where people are infinitely tortured, it seems strange to suggest that human beings are choosing that through remaking this coercive contract that God has so beneficently, mercifully offered to us. So that way of speaking, I think, is I don't find that compelling, and it's just it's very familiar as the way that like a mafia member might speak.
Yes, ma'am.
With all due respect,
I have a question about the practical significance, I guess, of what we're talking about this evening. So I'm curious if humanity, chose whether that was a atheistic basis for morality or a theistic, kind of wholeheartedly. How would you imagine that would make? How would that be different? How would our world be different?
I think that's a great question. And I do believe that it has profound practical implications, because the system of ethics that I'm advocating is one in which it's human values, human interests, that's fundamentally of concern to us. We're not searching for an authority to tell us how to circumvent human interests. So we're not ever going to come to the conclusion, for example, that a blastocyst with 200 cells, no capability for feeling or suffering, is as important as a human adult person who's going to suffer from having that blastocyst in her womb. These are the sorts of conclusions that require metaphysical assumptions that are built up through an authoritarian way of thinking. It's fundamentally that authoritarian mindset, which, mind you, isn't just a religious problem, right? Just look at how often people in Vancouver will tell you that their decision to do X, Y, or Z was right because it's natural, or because everyone else is doing it. These are fundamentally authoritarian appeals, and I think that to the extent that we lessen those sorts of that sort of reasoning, we're better off.
How do you distinguish between situations where the human interests basically clash? So, because, from a Christian perspective, you would argue that, again, that the idea is that you want to uphold human dignity and human worth, and so that if the interests of the many clash with the interests of the few, but the interests of the many essentially would compromise human dignity and human worth in the worth of the few, then the right decision is not to go with what benefits the many, but what benefits the few. And it seems like it's very easy in your model to segue into a situation of some form of utilitarianism where it's the greatest good for the greatest number, and if you're not part of that greatest number, then you wind up suffering, and perhaps even suffering unjustly. So how do you, in your approach, protect against that situation?
Yeah, I'm extremely sympathetic to that problem, because it's something that we see all around us. What Dr. Rana is talking about is the problem of the tyranny of the majority, right? So where the majority votes to legislate laws that benefit the majority, but degrade or take away the fundamental rights of the minority. And we create systems to prevent that sort of thing, like in the United States. I mean, this is the point that I've been making all tonight. You and I agree that human beings have intrinsic moral worth. It's just that you go one step further and say, well, we can't just look at human beings and value them. We have to add this concept of an image of God, or, if you like, the cosmic purpose that we were created with in order to animate that value. And I don't see the need for that, and I don't see how it helps as well. So I have no problem with suggesting that society is better off, and that we have actually agreed. Society. I'm not sure actually what the laws are in Canada exactly. I've only been here for 5 years, but hey. But I think that it is actually a rational conclusion for society to prevent the majority from tyrannizing the minority on the basis that we wouldn't want the minority to tyrannize us. There are just simply fundamental rights which we're not willing to subject to coercion, to legal redress. So.
Yeah, but in a sense, that's, to defend the view why many Christians are opposed to abortion, it's not because there's a desire to see the woman who's carrying the fetus experience undue suffering and compare her suffering to the suffering or the absence of suffering in the fetus that is aborted, but rather the idea is that whether or not an individual suffers or experiences pain is not what gives that person value or worth or allows one to do something to that individual or to that entity, but rather does that entity have, again, an intrinsic value on its own. And so that's, as a Christian, why would be opposed to abortion. It's, again, not a desire to make the life of a woman who doesn't want that pregnancy miserable, but it's, trying to give a voice to that human life that's within her.
I mean,
we've got time for one more question, so if we get into the abortion debate, we'll...
Yeah,
yes, sir, you be the last question.
Awesome. Okay, so my question is for Dr. Rana. I feel as though you debated a question before, and it would be of merit to revisit it. I'll accept nothing but a yes or no answer. Would you keep a slave for 7 years?
No.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your briefing. Thank you everybody here. It was a fabulous evening. Thanks to the UBC Freethinkers and to Reasons to Believe and the 10th Avenue Church. Thanks for inviting us. Thanks for having us. And thank you for your thoughtful questions.
if anyone is interested in continuing the conversation, just email me. I'm at Matt.